The real story starts hours before Kingsley was booked into the jail, unable to even stand on his own, accused of a crime he did not commit. An Eagan police officer spotted him driving his maroon car the wrong way on Pilot Knob Road in oncoming traffic.
Hey Kingsley.
Yeah.
Where do you live?
I don't know.
Kingsley just kept repeating, "I don't know," and was unable to do standard field sobriety tests.
One of the officers turns off his body-worn camera. The other officer did not. And the officer turned off his camera, says, "Dude, before you got here, got there, I thought he was having a stroke." And the last part of stroke is cut off because the officer who didn't get the memo to shut his camera off mutes immediately.
Officer Jensen can be heard on body cam saying doing a DRE evaluation would just be a whole bunch of time wasted. And when asked if Kingsley should be taken to the hospital, the DRE officer responded, "For what?"
Can you look at me?
Wake up!
As paramedics arrive, you can hear a guard and nurse discuss how Kingsley was ignored, the so-called well-being checks, just for show.
He said he's been like that all night. Not to worry about it.
No, that's not okay.
Well, his person is not checking when he's doing rounds.
Guards look in and document inmate and cell okay.
Paperwork says they checked on him and he was okay.
He was clearly not okay.
What was he?
Dying.
The police department is absolutely trying to cover this up because it looks really bad. The only criminals I saw in this case were the police and correctional officers at the jail, who all participated in the wrongful arrest and willfully negligent incarceration of a man that arresting officers not only knew was innocent, but also desperately needed medical attention. However, rather than doing the job that they were paid and trained to do, these officers decided to be lazy and knowingly chose to arrest this innocent man instead of taking the time to investigate and getting him the medical help that probably would have saved his life.
Says Bimpong was arrested and taken to the Eagan Police Station and then the Dakota County Jail, despite showing signs of a stroke.
Where he spiraled towards death over the next few hours.
Now, of course, there is a lot more to this story, like the $120 million lawsuit that has just been filed by this man's family. So, to better understand what's happening, why don't we go back to the beginning? Now, this case centers around 50-year-old Kingsley Bimpong, who is originally from the country of Ghana, which is located in West Africa. Now, I was unable to find when exactly Kingsley moved to America, but from what I was able to find in his background, Kingsley had lived in Chicago, Illinois for a while, before eventually making his way over to Cottage Grove, Minnesota. Now, while in Cottage Grove, Minnesota, Kingsley would eventually become a permanent resident of the United States, also known as obtaining his green card. Now, what this meant was Kingsley had a right to live and work in America, but still held a citizenship in Ghana. Now, starting in 2016, Kingsley began working for the United States Postal Service at their distribution center in the city of Eagan. Now, Kingsley would work the night shift at this distribution center, and by all accounts, he was a wonderful co-worker and employee. As a matter of fact, Kingsley was such a good employee, at times when he wasn't there, it was noticeable. And that is a perfect lead up into the incident that we're talking about today. The night of November 16th, 2024. Kingsley vanished.
The story starts here, at the United States Post Office's Eagan Distribution Center. Kingsley works the night shift. He began complaining of a headache and then just vanished from his job.
Now, reports state at some point during his shift, Kingsley began feeling unwell. Kingsley would report to his supervisor that out of nowhere, he began experiencing a pretty severe headache and was having trouble seeing. One of his coworkers would even go on to state that Kingsley appeared to be losing his mind due to some strange behavior. Now, Kingsley's symptoms would only get worse, so he decided around 10:42 p.m. to notify his supervisor that he was leaving. Now, unfortunately for Kingsley, the symptoms that he was experiencing began affecting his driving on the way home. So much so that just about 7 minutes into his drive home from work, an Eagan Police Sergeant, Joseph Moseng, witnessed Kingsley make a left-hand turn on a red light into oncoming traffic and wouldn't make it far at all before hitting a curb on the center median.
Records show an Eagan police officer spotted him driving his maroon car the wrong way on Pilot Knob Road in oncoming traffic, bumping into the center median. He was pulled over.
Maroon Ford Edge registered to a Kingsley Bimpong.
Now, of course, after witnessing all of this, that police sergeant rightfully pulled Kingsley over. And this is just the beginning of what would be Kingsley's last night alive. Now, everything I'm about to talk about is based on this 72-page lawsuit that I meticulously went through and broke down, because the full body camera footage and jail security camera footage hasn't been released yet. However, the lawyers who filed this lawsuit have the body camera and security camera footage. And boy, do they break it down in here. Now, apparently, within minutes of Sergeant Moseng making contact with Kingsley, right after initiating this traffic stop, it was abundantly clear that something was wrong with Kingsley.
According to the police report, Kingsley was extremely confused, did not know where he lived, and did not know where he worked, even though he was wearing a USPS vest.
Hey, Kingsley.
Yeah.
Where do you live?
I don't know.
Kingsley just kept repeating, "I don't know."
Kingsley was unable to tell the officer his own name, where he was coming from, where he was going, or where he lived. Kingsley was also so confused he was unable to follow simple directions, like shutting off his car, because he didn't understand what was being asked of him. And apparently when asked for his ID, Kingsley would wind up handing the sergeant his car keys. Now, obviously at this point, the sergeant would ask Kingsley to get out of his car, which Kingsley noticeably had trouble and would actually stumble getting out of his vehicle. Now, just a few minutes into the stop at 10:48 p.m., another Eagan police officer, Liam O'Shea, would arrive to the scene. And shortly after Officer O'Shea arrives, Sergeant Moseng can be heard requesting a DRE officer to respond to the stop.
And things just go downhill from there.
There was no sign or smell of alcohol.
Hey, if you're free, can you come over here, please?
So Officer Martin Jensen, Eagan's Specialized Drug Recognition Evaluator, or DRE, was called to the scene.
Now, quickly to explain, DRE stands for a Drug Recognition Expert. And these are officers that are specifically trained by the Minnesota State Police. And their training literally revolves around being able to differentiate somebody who's intoxicated on illicit drugs and somebody who has a medical condition or is experiencing a medical emergency. It's literally what they're trained to do. Now, these specially trained officers use a 12-step process to determine whether a suspected drunk driver is under the influence or experiencing a medical emergency or has a medical condition. And they're supposed to use this 12-step process during their investigation on every call. And just a fun fact, there are 323 DRE trained officers out of the more than 11,000 officers in the state of Minnesota. But I digress. Now, it would only take a couple minutes after the sergeant made the request for Eagan Police Officer Martin Jensen, who is DRE certified, to arrive to the scene. Now, apparently, right after Officer Jensen arrived to the scene, Sergeant Moseng and Officer Jensen would immediately mute their body cameras.
Officers spent more than 2 hours discussing what was wrong with him. Conversations that Bennett says were not always captured on camera, like this.
It says something along the lines of, "Dude, before you got there, I thought this guy was having a stroke." And stroke is cut off because then Jensen works to mute his camera.
And they would go on to do this multiple times during this stop. Now, I don't know about you, but what is the point of allowing the officers to mute their own body cameras if the whole point of having them is for transparency? How transparent can the body camera footage be if the officers have the ability to manipulate them? It makes no sense. If you ask me, somebody at dispatch should have control of the body-worn cameras at all times. And if they need to be shut off, the officer should have to make a request to dispatch, so the reason can be documented why. Apparently, Officer O'Shea, remember, he was the other officer that responded to this scene, didn't get the memo to mute his body-worn camera, which was able to pick up some of those muted conversations between Sergeant Moseng and Officer Jensen, which they allegedly would try to hide. Now, Officer O'Shea's body-worn camera would pick up the fact that those officers were heard saying that Kingsley did not smell like alcohol. Also, that Sergeant Moseng did absolutely no field sobriety testing. But what was damning that was picked up on Officer O'Shea's body-worn camera during these muted conversations was the fact that Sergeant Moseng stated that he still was not convinced that this was not a medical condition or related to some kind of medical emergency, and that Kingsley is, quote, on the struggle bus, which means they absolutely knew something was wrong with him. This was an obvious point where EMS could have easily been called and come out to assess Kingsley to see if he was having a medical condition or a medical emergency. But obviously I'm sitting here talking to you about this case, so that never happened. But despite all these warning signs and the fact that Sergeant Moseng freely admitted to the fact that he believed Kingsley was having a stroke, these officers would decide to treat this stop like a DUI. Now, DRE Officer Jensen, remember, drug recognition expert, extensively trained by the Minnesota State Police to be able to tell the difference between being under the influence and a medical condition, would decide to throw out all that training, failed to conduct that 12-step evaluation that we talked about earlier, which, remember, is supposed to be an integral part of his investigation to determine whether the driver is under the influence. Officer Jensen can be heard on his body-worn camera stating that there was no need for it because it was going to take too much time.
You can see in the video that Kingsley looks like one side of his face is not operating, one side of his body is not operating properly. He's answering questions repeatedly. I don't know. Where do you work? I don't know. He's wearing his USPS vest. So yeah, at a time when it wasn't just, you know, this is anybody. This is someone who has the specific knowledge base and training that is supposed to be able to make this determination, and not finishing that evaluation and just making the determination beforehand resulted in something really, really bad.
Instead, Officer Jensen chose to complete just a few steps in that evaluation, neglecting to do one of the major steps that probably would have saved Kingsley's life, getting his vital signs. As for Sergeant Moseng, he actually reached out to the Postal Distribution Center where Kingsley worked. And at one point, Officer O'Shea would actually try to assess Kingsley's level of consciousness by asking things like, do you know what day of the week it is? Do you know where you are? Do you know who the President of the United States is? But apparently Kingsley would just go on to repeat the statement, I want, being unable to answer any of these questions. And again, this should have been a red flag, but not for these officers. Instead, they would go on to get frustrated with Kingsley because he was actually wearing a work vest from the Postal Distribution Center, but when asked, Kingsley was unable to tell the officers where he worked. And for some reason, this made the officers frustrated. So they would go on to place Kingsley in handcuffs. And this was just after 11 p.m.
That protocol was ignored.
Basically, none of those are done.
The lawsuit alleges Officer Jensen can be heard on body cam saying doing a DRE evaluation would just be a whole bunch of time wasted. And when asked if Kingsley should be taken to the hospital, the DRE officer responded, for what? Kingsley was arrested, charged with DWI.
Now, at 11:08 p.m., after being placed in handcuffs, Officer Jensen transported Kingsley down to the police station. And this was so he can obtain a warrant to have Kingsley's blood drawn. Now, apparently during this time, per the lawsuit, it was obvious that Kingsley was having right-sided weakness, which is another classic sign of having a stroke. And this is where I think for a third time, Sergeant Moseng asked Officer Jensen if they should get Kingsley some medical help or take him to the hospital. And do you want to know what Officer Jensen's reply to this was? Take him to the hospital for what? Officer Jensen would go on to remind Sergeant Moseng that if they took Kingsley to the hospital, that an officer would have to sit at the hospital and wait there with him. I think we can all agree by now that Officer Jensen is a lazy piece of shit. He was going to make absolutely zero effort to make sure that Kingsley was okay. Apparently after this, Officer Jensen would go on to allude to the fact that he believed that Kingsley was on some sort of disassociative drug, despite the fact that Kingsley had absolutely zero criminal history or zero history of drug use. Now, around 11:50 p.m., a privately contracted EMS agency would show up to the police station after they obtained a search warrant and get Kingsley's blood. Now, this is pretty common. I've also worked as a paramedic for a private EMS agency, and they get contracted out to places like nursing homes, police departments, and other kinds of facilities to come over and do their blood work. Now, apparently during this time, Kingsley couldn't follow simple directions, like scoot over, and was also noticeably drooling down the side of his face. Unfortunately, the officer said nothing to the EMS crew about Kingsley's medical condition when they were there drawing his blood. If these officers would have spoke up, it would have literally been a 1-minute stroke test that could have been completed by an EMT that would have probably saved Kingsley's life. But those officers said nothing and just told the EMS crew to draw his blood. By this time, Officer Jensen had spent 83 minutes with Kingsley and could have been almost done with that evaluation. And also, while walking Kingsley back out to the patrol car to go to the Dakota County Jail, something damning was heard on the body-worn camera footage.
One of the officers turns off his body-worn camera. The other officer did not. And the officer turned off his camera, says, "Dude, before you got here, or got there, I thought he was having a stroke." And the last part of stroke is cut off because the officer who didn't get the memo to shut his camera off mutes immediately.
Now, Sergeant Moseng had already turned off his body-worn camera, but apparently Officer Jensen didn't get the memo. And this is when Sergeant Moseng is heard making the statement to Officer Jensen, "I thought before you got there, dude was having a stroke." But right as Sergeant Moseng was going to say the word stroke, Officer Jensen quick muted his body-worn camera, and it would only partially catch the word stroke. Right after saying this, the sergeant can be seen in the body-worn camera footage kind of pulling his hat down over his face, acknowledging the fact that he said something he wasn't supposed to say. Because remember, they only muted the body-worn cameras. They didn't actually shut them off, so they were still visually recording. At this point, if you ask me, these officers are knowingly complicit with denying Kingsley medical care. Now, at 12:48 a.m., Officer Jensen would transport Kingsley to the Dakota County Jail. And apparently, once they arrived to the jail, Officer Jensen told the Dakota County Jail staff that Kingsley had no issues, which is an outright lie. And Officer Jensen would go on to write in his report that Kingsley was jailed due to his high level of impairment and the fact that he believed that Kingsley would go on to hurt himself or others if he was immediately released in his current state. Now, I can go on for hours about the things that happened at the Dakota County Jail, like the fact that A, they did not complete the medical evaluation that was required to be completed within 2 hours of Kingsley arriving to the jail. Instead, you can see here, they did things like manhandle Kingsley, trying to get him into the body scanner, because at this point, Kingsley couldn't even stand on his own. One of the corrections officers can actually be seen in the security camera footage kicking Kingsley's right foot forward because, again, Kingsley was having right-sided weakness, so he couldn't move his right foot. Now, instead of completing any of Kingsley's medicals or his psych evaluation, which is required to be done within 2 hours of Kingsley arriving to the jail, corrections officers would go on to drag Kingsley through the jail and place him in this intake cell, cell 321. Now, over the next 3 hours and 22 minutes, Kingsley's condition would rapidly decline. And this was abundantly clear to the corrections officers, who every 15 minutes would walk by Kingsley's cell and do an evaluation. At least that's what they documented. Now, these 15-minute well-being checks would go on to be repeatedly falsified by the corrections officers. Right here, you can see at multiple times the corrections officers would just mark inmate and cell okay. But as you can see in these pictures from the security camera footage, Kingsley's condition rapidly deteriorated, and it would have been abundantly clear to those corrections officers. At first, when they put Kingsley in that cell, you can see him here seated on the bench seat. Kingsley would go on to attempt to use the toilet in that cell, but he would fall multiple times and strike his head.
Minutes later, he falls, and hour after hour after hour, he rolls on the floor, unable to stand.
Now, one thing about the cell that Kingsley was in, it is literally surrounded by windows. And you can see in each of these pictures, the guards walk by and see Kingsley now laying on the ground, reaching out towards the door as if he's reaching for help. However, he is repeatedly ignored. Instead, those corrections officers would go on to falsify documents and write inmate and cell okay on these well-being checks, which is an official document and a crime.
Guards, look in and document inmate and cell okay.
Paperwork says they checked on him and he was okay.
He was clearly not okay.
What was he?
Dying.
Over the next 3 hours, these well-being checks were being completed, as you can see in the security camera clips. That was until 3 hours and 22 minutes after Kingsley made it into the jail. And this Corrections Officer Corbin, made the statement that something was going on with Kingsley. You can see her kind of mimic what Kingsley looked like on the ground by reaching up in the air. Now, according to Officer Corbin's report, she would go on to alert the other corrections officers who were supposed to be watching Kingsley about his condition. But she was told by those corrections officers that he had been like that all night and he was fine, which by this point, he obviously wasn't. Now, from what I can gather, I believe Officer Corbin left that unit and went and told a higher up at the jail, because just minutes later, one of the COs who was supposed to be watching Kingsley, CO DeCash, returned with a nurse. Now, when that nurse entered the cell, Kingsley was found to be foaming from the mouth, having seizure-like activity, and was completely unresponsive. Oh yeah, and he was also cold to touch, probably from being on that cement floor for the last 3 hours. And this is finally when the first set of vital signs was taken on Kingsley. And they would go on to find that Kingsley's blood pressure was so high that the nurse was unable to obtain it. Now, in all of her knowledge and wisdom, apparently this nurse, Nurse Holman, gave Kingsley Narcan before EMS arrived. But obviously that didn't help. However, when EMS arrived, they reported Kingsley's blood pressure as 240 over 216.
Come on. Can you look at me? Wake up.
As paramedics arrive, you can hear a guard and nurse discuss how Kingsley was ignored. The so-called well-being checks just for show.
He said he's been like that all night. Not to worry about it.
No, that's not okay.
Well, his person is not checking when he's doing rounds. He's just walking by and scanning.
Finally, taken to the hospital.
I've been a paramedic since 2008 and a nurse since 2019. That is one of the highest blood pressures I've ever seen. And once again, another sign of having a stroke. Now, Kingsley was transported to Regina Hospital, which was about 6 minutes away from the jail. And he would arrive at Regina Hospital at about 5:21 in the morning. Now, the hospital report states that when Kingsley arrived, his blood pressure was 238 over 165, still astronomically high. His pupils were unequal and he was making abnormal movements with his arms and legs. That hospital would go on to test Kingsley for drugs and alcohol, which all came back negative. They would then do a CT of Kingsley's head, which showed Kingsley was in fact having a hemorrhagic stroke.
Finally, taken to the hospital, where it was determined he'd been suffering for hours when every minute counted from an untreated stroke.
And by this point, it was so bad that the pressure inside of Kingsley's skull was actually shifting his brain over to the other side and out the bottom of his skull. At 6 a.m., one of the nurses from the hospital noted that Kingsley began having decorticate posturing, which is a sign of severe brain damage. Now, fast forward to 9:28 a.m., Regina Hospital decided that Kingsley needed a higher level of care. And as you can see on this map, that hospital was about a half hour away. Now, sadly, once Kingsley made it to United Hospital, his condition didn't get any better. After multiple tests and a consult with neurosurgery, it was found there was nothing doctors could do. The pressure inside Kingsley's skull was so high that it was actually cutting off the circulation to his brain. And after what I'm sure was a heartbreaking conversation with his family, it was decided that Kingsley was going to be taken off life support. At 12:32 p.m. on November 19th, 2024, Kingsley Bimpong's heart had stopped after being taken off life support. Now, of course, in the aftermath, Kingsley's family had a ton of questions for the jail and the police department about exactly what happened, and also a lot of medical bills. And what do you think the jail and the police department did?
In a statement, the city of Eagan says while Mr. Bimpong's death is tragic, he was not exhibiting an objectively serious medical condition that was obvious to lay persons at the time he was in the Eagan officer's custody, and there's no indication that he required emergent medical treatment.
The police department would go on to say that they had no idea that Kingsley was having a medical emergency during his stop, that there was nobody there trained to identify that, which is really weird because I'm pretty sure they had one of their own drug recognition expert officers arrive to the scene who was specifically trained in identifying the difference between being under the influence and a medical emergency or condition. And what makes matters worse, you want to know what the jail did? They furloughed Kingsley after he died. Because he was in their custody when he was transported to the hospital, they were going to be on the hook for all those medical bills. So instead of actually having to pay them, what they did was they furloughed Kingsley, meaning they released him from jail after he died so they wouldn't have to pay the medical bills, despite the fact that Kingsley was obviously in custody when this happened. Disgusting behavior on behalf of that Dakota County jail. If you ask me, all these people involved belong in jail. But wouldn't you believe it? Not a single person has been disciplined or criminally charged since this happened. So where are we now? Well, the Department of Corrections did do an investigation after Kingsley died, and they found that every single one of the corrections officers involved in this incident, all of their CPR and first aid cards were expired. And like I stated earlier, that Department of Corrections also found that the corrections officers failed to get that medical evaluation done within 2 hours of Kingsley arriving to the jail. The Department of Corrections also found failure in the well-being checks, obviously, in this incident. Apparently, the Dakota County Jail in 2021 had a failed history with the Department of Corrections for completing these well-being checks properly. So they have a history of doing this. Now, again, was anybody disciplined for any of this? Absolutely not. And lastly, 2 weeks ago on October 8th of this year, Kingsley's family filed a $120 million federal lawsuit in this case.
A new lawsuit says Kingsley Bimpong suffered a stroke while driving. It claims 3 Eagan police officers and 8 Dakota County correctional officers ignored every red flag. Their decisions cost him his life.
There were checks happening. They weren't reacting to anything that could easily be observed. You know, him on the floor.
The lawsuit seeks $120 million in damages and policy changes at the Dakota County Jail.
Naming all the corrections officers involved, all of the Eagan police officers involved, and Dakota County itself. And that's where we're at, folks. Now, if you made it all the way to the end, thank you so much for watching. My name is Sai, and my channel is Dark Times with Nico and Sai. If you haven't already, please make sure to like the video and leave a comment. I try and answer as many comments as I can because I want to hear from you. And also, please make sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Subscribing costs you nothing, and it really helps push my content out to a wider audience. And it's very much appreciated. Now, I do also have memberships to the channel. Never have brought this up before in any of my videos. And I think it's really only like $1 or $2 a month. And really all it is just provide support to the channel. You get a little like emoji thing next to your name. And lastly, I know I still sound funny. Again, I just had major dental surgery a couple weeks ago. It's probably gonna be a while where I sound kind of funky, but we'll get through it together. Again, guys, thank you so much for watching. And I really hope to see you in the next video. Goodbye for now.